Okay, thank you for coming, everyone. I'm so excited. I love small rooms filled with lots of people. And of course, we have some friends on Zoom. I'm Ty Edwards. So I'm a history professor and director of the Kansas Studies Institute, but that's not why we're here. We were here because I had read this book, Of Boys and Men, Ty's copy, Of Boys and Men. I'll make sure I'm on camera. Of Boys and Men, and I had brought it up, right? So in August, I had talked to some of my colleagues and it just came up. I was like, hey, that thing we're talking about, I think you should read this book. And after I said it 3 times, I was like, we should just let it be, everyone has a chance to read this book. So we want to thank Faculty Development for supplying us with the books. And I want to say, I ordered more books. So if any of you do not have the book and you want it at the end of the meeting, just come and let me know. I've got a box of them so we can give them out for anyone else that wants one. It's an excellent read. So we decided to get a group together, and anyone, faculty, staff who wanted to participate, we've been doing it. We've had great attendance at our meetings, great discussions at our meetings, and we tried to share the notes because, you know, not everyone can go to every meeting. So here we all are. It's wonderful to be together. Remember, anyone that wants to stay, we're doing a lunch after this, so we can also talk about what we learn in this event, reflect more, get to know each other better as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Richard Reeves in a second, but we have a set of questions. By the way, raise your hand if you have empty seats by you. Dan and Michael have seats by them. Jan has some. Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to do 6 questions that I have shared with Richard in advance. And then afterwards, we'll have time for audience questions. Okay, so be thinking if you have some as we go along. And then I will also moderate if there are any from our folks on Zoom so that they can submit questions too. So let me introduce Richard before we go any further. And of course, he has a wonderful and prolific bio. So Ty's going to do the edited tie down version and hopefully hit the important things. So Richard Reeves is the founding president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, which is the first and only national organization dedicated to objective, nonpartisan research and policy development aimed at enhancing the well-being of boys and men. He's also the author, as you well know, of the 2022 book, right? Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. I'm assuming most of you know that here at JCCC, we had a group that we read the book and we met 3 times to talk about it because we wanted to sort of reflect on this in our personal lives and our professional lives. Richard is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he previously served as director of the Center on Children and Families. And I think many of you know that the Brookings Institution also published the book. So in September 2017, Politico magazine named Richard one of the top 50 thinkers in the US for his work on class and inequality. He is also a British American. He earned his bachelor's from Oxford and a doctorate from Warwick. So I should probably be saying Dr. Reeves. I apologize, messed that all up.
No problem.
Richard lives in East Tennessee and is the proud father of 3 boys. And I'm Ty Edwards, the proud mother of 2 boys. And so on that note, I do want to say percentage of people related to boys is, of course, 100%. On that note, Richard, I will start with our first, let me say that, some thank yous. So I also want to thank Kate Allen, the JCCC Foundation, Michael Brooks from Assessment, and Faculty Development for funding to help support us in getting the books, having the event today, and doing the lunch that is afterwards. Okay, so after all of that, hopefully our late Zoom friends have all arrived with Ty's long introduction. Okay, so we'll start with our first question. So Richard, what has the reception been for your book, especially among populations you discuss in the book, such as liberals and conservatives, feminists, but of course, and especially men?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you, Ty. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I have mixed feelings about everyone reading the book. I don't know if that was some sort of negative performance management system that you're forcing everyone through. It's a bad sign, but I appreciate the interest in the work, and I actually mean that very genuinely because it wasn't clear, to answer your question, how this would be received, to be honest, when it came out. Actually, my Brookings colleagues lined up outside my door to warn me against writing about the problems of boys and men, really believing that it was just impossible to do so without being cast as a reactionary, somebody who was anti-women, anti-women's progress, etc. Such was the polarized nature of the debate. And actually, I was shopping around for other publishers and thought I had a good chance, and I couldn't get another publisher. And it was specifically because publishers just wouldn't touch the issue. And so I was very proud to be published by the Brookings Institution Press, but I did so with some trepidation, given that I'd been rejected by every other publishing house, and given that pretty much every colleague I respected at Brookings was telling me not to do it. So that's the backstory. And then it comes out, and I would say that the reception has been much better than perhaps, certainly that I'd feared and that my colleagues had feared. And I think that might be partly because I think I'm probably equally critical of left and right on this issue. I think that the left has just ignored it, and I think that the right has weaponized it, to be very blunt. But I don't think either side comes out of my analysis well, and I think that gives me a little bit of credibility on both sides. And I will say that my experience has been that if you talk about the issues of boys and men in the right way, and by the right way, I mean with evidence, with data, and with evidence, with empathy, and without framing it as a zero-sum game, and in any way saying that it means doing less for women and girls. And what I found is that almost by creating that permission space, that's actually a lot of people have then come forward. And that actually, once you get past the fear, where is he going with this? Actually, a lot of people want to talk about it because, as you said, everyone's related to a man or a boy. Everyone who's looking at the data in certain areas sees these issues, right? And very often, honestly, we're living them as parents or as wives or brothers or whatever. And so in some ways, it was just I saw the main role as creating a permission space. And you were kind to mention some of the earlier accolades, but the ones that have meant the most to me this year, so this is 2 years later, is to be nominated by Melinda French Gates as one of her gender equality champions, getting $20 million to spend, and to be on Barack Obama's summer reading list. Now, interestingly, I wasn't on his 2023 reading list, which would have made more sense in terms of timing. And I don't think it's because he's a slow reader. But it may well be that it just took another year for even Obama to feel like it was okay to put my book on his list because the sensitivities around it have been so great. So I would say so far so good. I have some substantive disagreements with people on both sides. I'm genuinely non-partisan. And in the end, I'm just trying to create a better world for everybody, including our boys and men.
Awesome, thanks. Can you add a little bit more, like just everyday men, sort of just men in the wild? How have they responded to your book, or what feedback have you received?
Yeah, well, this is the bit that I wasn't really ready for, and I'm sometimes surprised by, because I mean, some of you have read the book, so I think you'll agree with me that it's a really boring book. I mean, this is a think tank book written by a think tank press. I mean, I fancy myself as a decent writer, but I was not expecting a broader audience for this book. And I want to be clear that it's had some success in certain circles, but it's not a runaway bestseller or anything. But I have nonetheless been surprised that when I go to colleges or community events, etc., that there is almost always some people in the audience who I wouldn't say are people I expected would have come across the book or my work, and that's an important distinction, who've been really helped by it. And that's not been something I expected. It's not been something that my previous work has prepared me for, but to have a young man come up to me and, be in tears and say how lonely he is and how he's been struggling to find a way to talk about this in a way that doesn't get him in trouble, or a mum and her son, who just sometimes excited that I'm there, which is super weird for me. And I don't think it was the book so much as some of the associated work. So I'm recording a podcast with Theo Von tomorrow, who's I think one of the top 10 podcasters. I did a video with Big Think that I think has got 6 million views, and very often it's the ancillary products that have got to people as much as the book itself. But all of those rest on the book. It's just that I think that by good fortune, I had good timing with the sense that it turned out that a lot of people did want to talk about this, and a lot of young men in particular just wanted to be heard and seen. And they wanted the institutions like yours or mine, or they just wanted to know that we have their back. And they weren't always convinced that was the case. And someone coming along and saying, look, I have your back. We have your back. We see you. We see the issues. We're on it. We're taking it seriously. But by the way, that in no way means that we're going to do less for women. And we're in no way going to blame women for it. And anybody who's telling you this is women's fault is not your friend. And it turned out there was a bit of a gap in the market for that position.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so, we are academics. A lot of us here have doctorates also and are scholars. So you've written a book about broad cultural issues. So how do you address criticism about overgeneralization or essentializing gender roles, especially from academics and people like us?
Well, I've had some of that criticism, and I welcome it. One of my longer backstories is that I'm the biographer of John Stuart Mill, the 19th century liberal, and arguably really a kind of father of British feminism. And his view was always that like we learn from each other. Like I know that some of what I'm saying is wrong. I just don't know which bits of it are wrong yet, and I need your help to help me figure that out. And that's the purpose of dialogue. It's the purpose of education, in my view. So I welcome the criticism. There's a chapter in the book about sex differences, and it was the one that I was urged by more reviewers than any other chapter to remove. Is that why bother? Why bother getting into sex differences? You'll upset some people, especially in academia. You don't need it for the rest of your argument, but a number of others said that it's actually quite hard to find a good faith treatment of this difference. And I like the way you frame the question, Ty. It's like not over essentializing, right? Because I do think sometimes that there are differences between different groups that are at the average, right? But don't mean that it tells us anything about a particular individual. And the way I land on this, and I'd be interested to see how people here respond to it, is I felt like it was very easy, especially in kind of left of center spaces, and that would include a lot of academic spaces, to just go down the line of all differences are socialized, right? We're born blank slates and we're taught to be more competitive, more aggressive, or more nurturing, or whatever. And that's a pretty acceptable view. I think it's wrong. And that's not been my experience, and I don't think it's what the evidence suggests. But then you've got the other side of the argument is we're fundamentally different, and that's why men can never be preschool, elementary school teachers, and women can't be engineers, and whatever, which is clearly absurd as well. But the truth is that I think Hans Rosling said this, who wrote Factfulness, is that people have to understand that most distributions overlap. And so the truth is, any sex differences we might talk about, we have to figure out how much of it is socialized and how much of it might be something that comes along. And we can think of examples like risk taking and so on. But then how much are we really different, right? Probably the distributions overlap. And the example I quite often give is if I make the statement, men are taller than women, I bet everybody knows what I mean by that. I do not mean that every single man in this room is taller than every single woman in this room, right? I'm not going to make you all stand up and do it, right? But there are a lot of women who are taller than some men, right? What it means is on average, and the distributions are, and that there aren't very many very tall women. That's all it means, right? And I think most of the sex differences that are of relevance, particularly to educationalists, are kind of that kind. They're not differences. They are differences, but they're differences at the average. And there are going to be lots of girls who have, quotes, boy-like characteristics and boys who have girl-like characteristics. But if the differences are significant, then we shouldn't ignore them. That's the position I take, which is, I think, somewhere between the two ideas that it's either all nature or all nurture, which no one seriously believes. I shouldn't say that. I think some people do seriously believe that it's all socialization. But I have to tell you, like, having been in a human body for 55 years now and raised 3 boys, I recommend the book, Ruth Whitman's book, Boy Mum, who's very, very good on this issue. And so I just say that, and look, some people are still not going to agree, but I do think it's important to try and find a position that feels true to people, and that's the where I've landed.
Great, thank you for that. As a boy mom, I feel like that's an audiobook that I need over the break. Okay, okay, number 3. So how do you address skeptics who view changing the roles of men in society as something men need to adapt to, or as a transitory problem that doesn't require policy solutions?
Well, I'll do the academic thing and reject the premise of the question. Um, I don't think that even if something's a transitory problem, and I think there is a transitional nature to some of this, doesn't mean it doesn't require policy, because sometimes we need policy to help us through transitions. And I can think of plenty of examples of that, which I'll get to. So I think the broader point here is that we are fundamentally reshaping the relationship between men and women, particularly because of the changing economic position of men and women. And that's the result of what I would say is the greatest economic liberation in global history, which is the economic rise of women. Not complete yet, certainly not around the world yet, but nonetheless, it is a magnificent and extraordinary change in the space of a very small period of time. And so one data point I have in the book, and I find useful, is that in 1979, only 13% of women earned more than the typical man, so the median man. So only 13% of women would have been in the top half of the male wage distribution. And now it's 40% of women. Now, that's not 50%. That's not full equality yet, but by God, 40% is a different world to 13%. And this, of course, was to try and achieve what Gloria Steinem set out, which is to make marriage a choice rather than a necessity. And I think that we've made huge progress towards that goal. Again, not to say we're there yet. And you don't change economic relations between men and women that much, that fast, and there not to be some transitional issues, because you have along the way massively changed what it means to fulfill a male role. Like my father was the provider, right? That was just that was never a question for him or my mom or in our house, right? And I'm in transitional generation. And then we have another generation of young men where under the age of 30 now in most cities, women are earning as much as men. And so that's a huge change. And if it requires a bit of help to men to think about new jobs, to think about new roles, to support fatherhood through paid family leave, for example, fine. I don't mind that. After all, and I'll end with this, like if we take our lesson from the women's movement, we actually wanted to get more women into STEM professions, for example. We wanted to tackle the gender pay gap. We wanted to tackle discrimination against pregnant women. We wanted equality in the higher education system, hence Title. And what did we have? We had the equality law, Title IX, huge investments in women in STEM, scholarships, incentives, etc. We didn't just sit and wait for it to happen. We had intentional policies to help women through a positive transition. I just think we have to have the same approach when it comes to kind of helping men through the transition too, without backing off the stuff we're already doing for women.
Thank you for that. Okay, so number 4 that we're asking you here. So this is getting into some of the solutions that you were referencing in the last one. So how do you respond to the idea that your proposed solutions in the book, and you've mentioned a few of them, and I should tell everyone there's a lot more than we're going to have time to go into. You should read the text. And remember, I have some extras if anyone wants them at the end. So how do you respond to the idea that your proposed solutions in the book need to be more ambitious, such as universal pre-K or guaranteed paid parental leave, which are common in Europe, but not in the United States, and maybe even others than those that I list?
Yeah, well, thank you for pointing out that there are there are lots of solutions in the book. One of the things, and it was very, very intentional, because a lot of there's this problem in this sort of book, in nonfiction books of this kind, policy books, which is called, I can't remember who called it this now. It called it the Chapter 11 problem. And the Chapter 11 problem is that you write a 10-chapter book about how we're all going to hell in a handcart. Everything's democracy's done, equality's done, if opportunity's done, whatever it is. So you write a very, because that's where the money is, right? Is in sort of like very few people make a huge amount of money by writing books saying mostly things are mostly okay. That's a terrible selling book. And so you get these books with these 10 chapters of what's gone wrong. They send it into the publisher, and the publisher says, this is really gloomy. You've got to have some hope at the end. You've got to have some policy solutions at the end. And so the weary author writes chapter 11, which says we should do some stuff. And it's usually universal pre-K, to be honest, and maybe apprenticeships and whatever, depending on the book. And it's usually pretty shallow. I actually spend a lot of time on solutions, as you see from the book. Like I really wanted to offer a wide range of things for us to do, not because I think it's comprehensive or even that they're necessarily all the best ones, but because I wanted us to move into a conversation about what do we do about this, rather than just staying in what I think is sometimes the secular equivalent of the Book of Lamentations, right? There's a lot of lamenting going on in public life generally, and I wanted it not to be that. And some people like Michelle Goldberg in the Times and various others have made exactly this point, which is these feel pretty incremental, right? Starting boys in school a year later, more investments in apprenticeships, incentives to get more male teachers. For example, they're pretty small and incremental. Why don't we have more sweeping changes? Well, actually, I think some of my changes are quite sweeping. Like I think proposing paid leave for mothers and fathers each of 6 months at close to full pay is very radical, and I say that. And people have sometimes said, really? 6 months each? What are you, European? To which the answer is, well, I was. But interestingly, even since I published the book, the US military has introduced 3 months each for mothers and fathers of paid leave. So you've got to think, well, if the military can do it, maybe I wasn't so crazy after all. 6 months is a stretch, but okay, let's start with what the military has. And I will also say that I've faced criticism on the other hand, that sort of my ideas like starting boys in school a year later are just sort of breathtakingly radical, like crazily utopian. So on the one hand, some of they can seem incremental. On the other hand, they can seem utopian, depending on your point of view. And all I really care about is that we're arguing about solutions. And I'll just add one more thing. I was reminded of this when I just mentioned teachers. I made this point earlier about the overlapping distributions and differences. And I'll just say one more thing on that, because if you look at the distribution of interest in certain subjects and some differences that seem to be that's at least partly innate in interest between kind of men and women, that would lead you. So on average, women are a bit more interested in people and men are a bit more interested in things, right? On average. And conservatives, small c conservatives, sometimes use that as a reason to explain why there are not very many female engineers. But actually, there's no evidence that we're anywhere near a level of female women in engineering that would get close to being explained by those differences. It should be at least 30%, according to one paper I read. But equally, the other side, it may well be that even under conditions of complete choice, that we won't get 50% of elementary school teachers will be male, right? It might be, but it looks like it might be 30%. Right now, it's 10%. Elementary school teachers male and 15% women engineering. So we are a long way from feeling good about the fact that these look like the results of natural choices. And to personalize this a bit, my son just started work as an elementary school teacher in Baltimore City public schools. And my sister-in-law is an engineer. And anybody who told me that there's something wrong with my sister-in-law being an engineer or my son being an elementary school teacher would face some disapproval from me in the strongest terms. But that doesn't mean we won't recognize that at a population level that there might be some differences.
All right, yes, thank you. Okay, so we're a community college, right? So we sort of fill a specific niche in the higher ed industrial complex. So my next question for you is, what actions do you recommend a community college take that evidence shows will contribute to the success of men?
Well, the first thing I want to do is give an advertisement for a new initiative, the Higher Education Male Achievement Initiative, which the American Institute for Boys and Men has formed in partnership with the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. It's open to 2- and 4-year institutions. We're very new, a few months old. We have, I think, 20 institutions. So I'd recommend you consider joining that. Our first annual convening is going to be in April in Nashville. And part of that is to get this is to create a learning and practice community around what best to do. And so I've already learned more from that. A couple of things. One is I think community colleges are very often at the real sharp end of some of these gender issues. Like, it's really struck me that in terms of male enrollment and male completion, very often it is community colleges that's showing some of the most concerning numbers. Of course, there's declining enrollment generally, but in particular, we see male enrollment. So first of all, sharp end. So advert for HEMAC, as we call it, the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative. And the website for that is menincollege.org. But then I would just say, start with the data, look at where the data is, like make sure that you're breaking everything by gender, seeing where's the issue. Is it around enrollment? Is it around year 1 to 2? Is it around completion? Which subject areas is it in? Can we break by certain demographics? So one community college I went to, it was rural white men that they were really struggling with. And in other community colleges, they're enrolling black men, but the black men are not completing, whereas they're not enrolling Hispanic men, but the Hispanic men they enroll have better completion rates, etc. I'm just giving you examples there. And so I think just being very, very in the data, looking at it. And then out of that, having some intentional programming, right? A number of community colleges now have formed a men's resource center that creates a space, mentoring programs, etc. If they have a women's resource center, it's a natural partner. If they don't, you might think about how to structure it. But I'm very impressed with the ones I've seen, and I can give examples of particular ones. And then there are others that are doing like mentoring programs, peer support, specifically targeted at and framed in a way that is going to attract men. And the danger, of course, is that you get into real stereotypes here. But at one community college I was kind of at recently, and they've joined the Higher Education Male Achievement Network. This is Umpqua Community College in Oregon. The guy there, they have a full-time person now whose job it is to try and improve male outcomes. And he's discovered that the best thing he can do is fire up a grill and throw meat on it and wait for the men to come. And then while they're there, he talks to them about mentoring and so on too. And he's like, I know it sounds stereotypical, but what can I tell you? The smell of cooking meat seems to have this magic effect. So I'm not saying that's the answer. University of Vermont does a entrepreneurship thing, which isn't open to all, but it tends to skew male. And so in the same way that I think we try and think about how to make our offerings, atmospherically and culturally appropriate for women, we also need to just make sure that we're doing the same for men. That includes who do you send into the community, who are your outreach people, what does your brochure look like, what does your website look like, all of that just needs to make it feel like we all belong.
I will say, Richard, I read the part of your book where you said that public schools need more physical education and better food. I read that out loud to my sons, and they were like, preach. I mean, they were definitely on board with that.
Right. We're not I think I said we're not brains on sticks. We're bodies as well. We have to treat our bodies. And God, don't get me started on school meals in public school.
Well, I will say, just to show a sad side story, I've had to have my doctor fill out notes so that my kids can eat more than they're provided at lunch at school, which I also find weird, but whatever.
Yeah, and we have cut recess, and it's very interesting that the participation in sports in middle and high school is going down for boys. It's going up for girls. The lines haven't crossed yet, but they will soon. But it's actually declining for boys, and so that's about access to coaches, pay for play, kind of etc. But physical activity, and again, it's one of those things where you risk a stereotype, but on average, it looks as if boys and young men learn better and do better in life if they do get more regular opportunities to move their bodies. It doesn't mean it isn't good for girls and women too. Of course it is, but it just looks like the average. It hurts boys more to cut recess.
Yeah. Welcome to my home life. Okay. All right. So speaking of that, number 6. So what other actions do you recommend we as individuals, as citizens, as educators take to support boys and men?
Yeah, so I started by saying I think a lot of this is about the tone and the frame, and I think that actually just making sure that we're open-hearted, that we're empathetic, and that we're not framing. This is the big breakthrough for me, and it's something I wish I had known when I was having some of the issues with my kids. That there's a tendency, I think, in the education system especially, to have a default setting about what kind of student you're serving or what kind of student is the norm, and that's a girl or a woman. It's a female default. And so I really, really do worry that we treat our boys like malfunctioning girls. That at some level, we're always asking the question, why aren't you more like your sister? And in fact, I will confess that I used to ask that question, why aren't you more like your sister? And my boys didn't have a sister. I had an imaginary sister for them that I could compare them to negatively. But that thought, and so I think the frame is really important. A lot of our institutions are just not serving our boys and men as well as they should be. That's not their fault. It doesn't mean that they're not responsible. Come back to one of your earlier questions, but to do the best they can. It's not a cop out, but I do think we have to recognize that sometimes this, it is a bit of a square peg round hole thing. Never use the term toxic masculinity. Happy to get into a discussion about that. I would love to see that term binned, but the broader point behind it is to not inadvertently approach this with the deficit model of like, what's wrong with you? And is it something about your masculinity or something about the fact you're a boy, right? There's been a bit of a tendency towards that framing in some circles and even in some families. And I think that has created a really dangerous vacuum where a lot of boys and men feel like they can't really speak up or be heard or be sympathized with, in part because they're male. And I think that's been a real problem and something that I think a lot of parents need to learn as well as educators and the broader community. We can just have a better conversation about this. And one of the things I really noticed is that a lot of the kind of online figures who many boys have been attracted to over the last few years, and you can think about which one you pick, but I think one of their sort of magic has been just to kind of make a lot of boys and young men feel like that they care about them. It turns out that empathy is incredibly radical and in the wrong hands can be very dangerous. And so, but it's more interesting to me is like, how can we have left a situation where so many of our boys and men are so looking for that they find it there rather than our own homes or our own institutions?
Okay, I'm going to open this up now to some audience questions. And if you are on the Zoom, use the Q&A feature and I'll moderate those and get those to Richard. So do we have any questions here in the room of someone who'd like to start us off? Yeah, Jim Likert.
So my question deals with the recent election. Your book is 2 years old. Does it please you that you noticed something that a lot of pollsters missed, namely that men under 30 seem to be attracted to the politics of the right? And then related to that, does the result of the recent election cause you to think that some of your solutions offered in the last few chapters might in fact be too utopian now?
Thank you. Does it please me? No, I did see. You're right that part of my diagnosis was that problems that are ignored become grievances. And sort of legitimately, right? If they're real problems and they're really being ignored, then it's kind of right that they should become grievances. But the trouble is that then grievances can be weaponized by reactionaries. And I want to emphasize, I'm not partisan about the issues that I'm involved in at all. So no, it doesn't please me because I would love this to be not a partisan conversation, not a culture war conversation on either side. And just to be like a straightforward conversation so that institutions like yours are looking at your data and saying, wow, we're failing a lot of our young men. What can we do? Let's look for some solutions. It's just straightforward. It's not like, I want this to be obvious. I said the book was boring. One of the internal mottos of the Institute is keep it boring, right? We deliberately want to be boring. And as my son said, well, you're the man for that job, Dad. He's the one that's a teacher, so you can see why he's a good teacher. It's a serious point. Like I'm not going to write about Moana 2 or the Barbie movie or the man versus bear controversy, whatever. Like there's just too much important stuff. And so I would love it if there's more permission space on both sides to have a non-zero sum conversation about this. As to what it means for the solutions, I will say that it's the idea that the notion that it's a bad idea to ignore these problems is less controversial now than it was a month ago or 2 months ago. Right. So to the extent that I feel like I've sometimes been banging my head against the brick wall and just come up bloody, mostly, I feel like the wall's moved a bit now. I don't know what the new political configurations will mean for solutions. I can see some things to be hopeful about at a national level with a Republican administration. I can see a lot of stuff happening at state level with both some Democrats and some Republicans, but I think it's too early to know what happens on the right. So my line to the right is, well, men just delivered you victory. So are you going to deliver for men? Here are some ideas, including massive investments in apprenticeships, community colleges, etc., HBCUs. I don't know if they'll bite. Meanwhile, I think on the left, I am getting a lot more interest in the work, kind of for them anyway. I think a little bit late, but politics is very often a very long-term business. Thank you for the question.
Other questions here in the room? Yeah, Bill?
This feels very familiar, seeing you through a screen like this. For the last couple of years, I've noticed that like YouTube really is promoting you, at least in my algorithm. And I'm wondering if you're finding yourself in this position as a spokesperson for men, as sort of a representative, as an advocate for men everywhere. And if you're feeling that, how are you navigating that?
We should seriously reset your YouTube algorithm if you're seeing a lot of me in it. But I guess that's how it works, right? You click on a couple of things here and there, and things come through. It comes back to the earlier answers. Like I have really struggled with the extent to which this is a cultural challenge, as opposed to like a policy challenge or like like my comfort zone is research and policy. But as your algorithm suggests, and as some of the invitations I'm getting suggest, like I have no idea what I'm going to say to Theo Von tomorrow. Like that, I don't even know where to start, right? I have felt called into something more of a spokesman role than I had ever intended. That's not always comfortable for me, but I modestly think that I've gotten quite good at it. And I actually think the fact that I'm quite sort of data-driven, quite level, is actually, and the fact that people seem interested in that, I think is a good sign. And I think it's also a bit of a sign of the times. I think people are a little bit fed up with kind of partisan clickbait stuff. Like I have never tried to get clicks. I have never done anything with the intention of like, oh, this will get 6 million views. And it turns out, I think in this new environment, that people are kind of hungry for authenticity. I think they're just kind of hungry for people calling it as they see it. And so I just call it as I see it. And I think the other thing is that I'm unapologetically on the side of boys and men. I'd never thought I'd do this. I founded a new institute to work on boys. But without ever, I think, or I hope, giving the impression that that's motivated by anything that's against women. And I think that it turns out that there is a lot of interest in that position. It's not like controversial enough for some people maybe, but I think isn't that where most people actually are, right? Which is that they are worried about their sons and their daughters. They're worried about their brother's mental health and whether their sister's going to face discrimination at work. I mean, like that's and so I think that in some ways, I just think I've ended up accidentally playing a bit more of a cultural role than I intended. And I'm comfortable with it up to a point. But I really hope that over time, it will become much less necessary because institutions like yours, the media, think tanks, well, of course they'll do stuff on boys and men. Why wouldn't they? We're not there yet. I hope we will be.
Okay, good. Yes, Jody. Okay, so he might not see you, so maybe.
Oh,
stand
that's
up.
okay. Well,
Yeah.
that's explain.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
It's off camera, so
Yeah,
go on.
sorry.
There you go, there you go.
There.
Yeah.
So if you were to write this book again now, would you change anything dramatically from the first time around?
It's a great question. I think the honest answer has to be would be not, because I think it's worked. And and so like if it ain't broke, by and large, don't fix it. So I think and I will say that like I've written quite a few books, and I think it's probably the hardest one I've written in many ways, just because getting the tone right, getting it personal enough, but with the right data, like, because I was so committed to this as a persuasive project. I really wanted to change the conversation about boys and men, and I knew that was going to be incredibly difficult plane to land. And so I was really attentive to the language, and it went through a lot of drafts, which is not always the case with me. I think the one thing that I really got wrong was in my description of fathers and of fatherhood. And it took a man in tears to really underline this to me. He waited to talk to me after a speech I'd given, quite not long after the book came out, and I'd presented, and he said, "You treat fathers as if they only matter because they make for better outcomes for their kids. You treat fathers like a means to an end. You have all this data, like kids who have engaged fathers are more likely to graduate high school, more likely to go to college, less likely to have mental health problems." He said, "Sure." He said, but he's in tears, and he said, "You know what?" He said, "I don't have anything else in my life right now except being a dad. That is like literally my reason for being." And you'd never once talked about fatherhood as something good for fathers. You only ever talked about fatherhood as something good for their kids. And I realized in that moment how wrong I'd been about that. And so I've been trying to make up for it since in other writings. And I just realized it was not, thinking about myself. And so I think fatherhood as an identity, and the Surgeon General has gotten very interested in this recently. I think the role of what it means to be a father is just so much more important than just what it means for kids to have a father, right? And as a social scientist and someone focused on mobility, I've always looked at this like through the lens of what does this mean for the kids' outcomes. And so he just absolutely floored me, and I became a little bit tearful with him too. And I got that horribly wrong, and I would rewrite that chapter and talk about the importance of fatherhood for men and not just fatherhood for their kids.
Okay, good. Other questions in the room? Yes.
This question just popped into my head, so I apologize if it's clumsy, but I was reflecting on my youth and how it bothered me at the time, how most of the male.
I'm really sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Oh, I'm
yes.
sorry.
I can't hear the question.
The programming on television in my youth cast fathers as largely as buffoons. And it bothered me as a child, one of 3 daughters with a very functional father. I don't think I see that as much anymore, but what might have been the effect of those negative role models?
Yeah, so she's asking,
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you.
did you catch that, Richard?
I think it cleared towards the end. So I think it's the perhaps obsolete portrayal of fathers and men generally as buffoons in popular culture and the consequences of that. Did I get that right?
Yes, yes, that's it. Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a problem. I think it's still a bit of a problem. Okay, I'll make a broader point. I do think that, like, if there's a family in a sitcom, I'm thinking about Modern Family, but others, right? And one of the parents is pretty competent and has got their act together, and the other is not quite as competent, maybe a little bit chaotic and disorganized, etc. It's always the dad who's the latter, right? But, you struggle to find, and I can't think of an example of like maybe someone can, but where like the dad has really got it together, right? And he's organized and calm and all that, and the mum is a mess, just think of many examples like that. And so I do think it plays into a stereotype, which is very damaging to the idea of fathers and men. I think more recently the problem's shifted a little bit. I think you're right that that's a bit less true in those things, but actually I think in a very well-intentioned effort on the part of Hollywood, especially in movies, etc., to kind of promote women, there has been something of a tendency to cast men in roles where they kind of need to be educated out of their toxic masculinity or whatever. And I think I understand why, because we're trying to redress the balance. But I think in some of the Disney movies, I don't really watch them, to be honest, and don't comment on them. But I think sometimes it's hard. It was a bit true of the, I'll say to you, a bit true of the Barbie movie. I'm told it's true of Moana 2. Has anyone seen Moana 2? I guess you have to have young kids to have seen that. I'm told it's a bit true there. It's just that the men are either a little bit idiotic or a bit predatory, or something, right? They're not. There aren't very many kind of straightforwardly good portrayals of men. I don't know if that's true. I have a call with some Hollywood people on Friday. I haven't really gone into this space yet. But I would say my final comment on this is what I find about, and I watch, when you watch series, a lot of series now, there's very often an episode on the gender pay gap. I've noticed that in a lot of series recently, and it's usually, I get why they're doing it, but it's usually completely wrong empirically as to why there's a gender pay gap. And it feels a little bit performative. It feels like, oh, we need to have one on the gender pay gap. I think that Hollywood's, I'm using Hollywood more broadly, Hollywood's feminism isn't wrong. It's out of date. I just feel like it's like they still think it's the 90s, right? It's so, I felt that with a lot of these things. It's like, and a lot of young women are even like, yes, that's not quite the problem anymore. It's like, it's a different world now. And so, but I think the producers and the writers are sort of, particularly in the last few years, maybe the last 4 to 8 years especially, have been on a little bit of a roll around some of these gender issues, but in a way that isn't, it doesn't offend me. I don't think it's misandrist, in other words, hatred of men or anything like that. It just feels a bit old-fashioned to me. It just feels a bit more aimed at people in their, their 40s, 50s and above, and it's not really landing with 20-year-olds, for what it's worth.
Awesome. Other questions in the room? Yes, Kathy?
Well, as a mother of 2 boys and as a, teacher of a lot of young men, what tips maybe do you have for us in the classroom that we can do for our male students to help them be successful?
Great. Well, I'm not a specialist in either education or parenting, so usual caveats. Not a doctor, etc. But I think a couple of things. Like, one is, we've already mentioned this a little bit, but make sure move them around, move their bodies pretty regularly. And I think that's true even at like young adults. I mean, the male frontal cortex doesn't stop developing till the mid-20s, right? So like this. Like, for anybody under that age, there's still stuff developing, and it seems to develop better if there's a little bit of movement. The second thing is, and I have no expertise in this area, and I'm sure you all know much more about this than me, but it does look as if the evidence suggests that young men and boys struggle more with learning when they can't see the point of it. They can't see the application of it, right? If it's abstract, they struggle. If you apply it, if it's more, so I do think that more applied learning, it's one of the reasons why I think community colleges and other routes, by the way, like apprenticeships, trade schools, earn and learn, like technical high schools, I talk about this a bit in the book, like they're really good for boys. And this is not shop class. This is not a sort of, oh, boys should just go into shop. Like, it is more just like, it's very clear from the evidence that on the average, girls and young women are just better at doing abstract academic tasks. Right. Whereas boys are like, why am I learning this? Right. Tell me, they need a why before they'll do the what. And then the last thing is that this is a communication style piece, and it's more probably in the parental side than necessarily the educator side. But one of the things that I've learned in my own parenting journey, but also from the research now, is that there is, I'll stop saying on the average, because I think we all get that now. There's a difference in communication style, like that women are more comfortable communicating face to face, directly, and men and boys are more comfortable communicating shoulder to shoulder. If you go to any social event and watch this, this is a good time to do this as it's a holiday season. Like, watch how the men are standing in relation to each other. They'll always be standing catty corner to each other. Right? There'll always be an angle. There are people literally, their PhDs are measuring the angles that men stand in relation to each other. And it just turns out that, like, as men and boys are just a bit more comfortable communicating shoulder to shoulder. That's what road trips are about. That's what fishing is about. It is literally the only explanation for golf. It is just, what are we doing? Right? And the answer is, like, we're being friends. We're telling each other we love each other. We're talking to each other. And we're just, whereas going to a coffee shop, sitting down at a table, like with a coffee and staring directly at each other, just, we can't, guys, we can do that, but we don't like it, right? Women seem to be able to do it for hours. And my wife would get our kids would come home from school and she'd stare at them over the breakfast bar and say, have some protein. How was your day? It's back to the school meals thing. How was your day? And they'd be like, I don't know, fine. Like, but she'd like stare them right in the face. And what we realized was that, and then I remembered what I was like with my parents. We'd take them for a drive later, or we'd be watching a game, or we'd be video gaming or something. And then they'd say, oh, this weird thing happened today. So that it happened more organically. And so finding ways to engage in tasks that allow us then to have other conversations. It's why I'm so obsessed with the role of coaches, and why I'd love to see something like a Coach for America program coming, because I think that athletic coaches, especially for boys and for men, are mental health professionals in disguise. You are sitting shoulder to shoulder and asking how things at home, how you're doing, while you're pretending to be, while you're watching the game, right? And that whole thing, like, think about the image of like sitting shoulder to shoulder on a bench, etc. It's just an incredibly comfortable way for boys and men to communicate with each other. So think about how you're communicating, and don't inadvertently impose a sort of either a female or a male communication style on your kids or your students.
Yeah, thank you. I will say, on a side note, I've gotten that advice from a Kaw Nation tribal elder that you should talk to people not looking at them. He argued for everyone, but he did identify as male. So I'm going to end with our final question here, Richard. So can you tell us a little bit about what your American Institute for Boys and Men is doing? And I've shared the website. I can share with our folks again, but tell us a little bit more about what it's doing and what we can look forward to. And you've mentioned it several times, but what else can you share with us about it?
Yeah, well, thank you for that opportunity. Well, I've mentioned the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative. That's an exciting partnership for us, just because of the interest, including from you and others. I think higher education is where the rubber's really hitting the road around a lot of these issues. I think it's really a kind of intersection point. You see the results of what happens through K-12. We're also talking about young men who are in some ways the most vulnerable to many issues, many challenges, still finding their way in the world. And so higher education, I think, is just like, ground zero. So that's one of the reasons that we've got the interest in it. So yeah, as you said very kindly at the beginning, like, we're a 501c3 research and advocacy organization, small think tank, growing. Please sign up for our newsletter. That would be if you go to our website, aibm.org, you'll find a place for that so you can keep in touch. Our work thus far has been largely around raising awareness of these issues. We'll continue to do that, especially in the areas of education, mental health. We're moving more now into the areas of fatherhood and family and employment, like what's something around jobs. And we do have a cross-cutting theme where we're very interested in the specific issues facing Black boys and men, because they seem to be at the sharpest end of many of the issues that we write about. What we're now starting to do is build some communities and actually fund some researchers. So if anyone has kind of research projects, we actually are funding junior research fellows. That tends to be PhD students, but also academics in any kind of higher education institution who have good projects. We're taking on some senior fellows. And so we're actively looking to commission, we're trying to build the field. And so if you know of people who are working on this in this field who want to, or who want to go on to, or build courses around some of these issues, then please be in touch. My email is just richard@aibm.org, simple as it sounds, because I do think that watch this space means that for us, we'll do more work, but the level of interest actually from scholars in this is really, really high. And we now have some additional resources, and they're struggling to get their work funded from the normal foundation. There isn't a single foundation that has a boys and men program officer. There just isn't a funnel of money right now into the field. And so we're trying to become that funnel. And I have a lot of funders very interested in building the field. And so I think you'll see more of that. And then maybe come back to the other question about video, etc. Maybe a little bit more around video and cultural stuff. We'll see. But if I don't sound completely clear, it's because we have been so surprised on the upside by the level of interest and the level of opportunity. Like when I jumped, I'd been at the Brookings Institution for 10 years. Before that was in the UK government. And as you said at the beginning, I'm Brit American. And I got to tell you, the Brookings Institution, for those who don't know it, it's a really nice place. I mean, you get a nice retirement match. It's a nice brand. It's like a medieval sinecure, it's fantastic. Why would you leave, right? And set up a 501c3 and deal with all that and maybe not have the money, and how are you going to do that? And the problem I have right now is that I just don't know what to do with the levels of interest that we've got. And so we've hit a really, really, really important it's like striking oil in a way, but then you just don't know what to do with the response. So this is not a complaint. This is a great problem to have, but I'm honestly being outrun by the opportunities, and I'm so grateful for that. This conversation is a good example of it. Like the number of institutions and individuals who are, I think, willing to step forward. And the last thing I'll say is, I don't think anyone's coming for you if you talk about this issue in the right way. Maybe I should have said this at the beginning, but I sometimes think that people think there's like a feminist folk devil out there, like hovering over their left, like, oh, if we talk about this, if we have a conversation with Richard Reeves or about boys and men or whatever, like, that's controversial. We're going to tell you it's much less controversial today than it was 2 years ago. And second of all, I got money from Melinda French Gates. I'm doing a thing with Gloria Steinem. I've been on a panel with UN Women. No one's coming for you. The most thoughtful women's organizations are all over this issue. They recognize that this is not something we can continue to neglect. And so people are afraid of their own shadow around this now. If you do it the right way, then no one's coming for you. Everybody wants to do this work. It's not zero. There isn't a limit to our empathy. And just making more of our boys and men feel like we noticed, we got you, we have your back. It's so powerful. And so I just that's my way of thanking you for your interest in this work. And if there's any more I can do to help, then do let me know, because this will be done in institutions like yours and in conversations like this. But most importantly, the conversations you're all going to have with the boys and men in your lives as a result of this conversation. So I want to thank you for that.
All right, let's give Richard a hand.
Thank you all so much for your questions and for coming.
Thank you so much, Richard. We appreciate this so much. And thank you for sharing your book and for writing that text that allowed us to get around this material and then just jump right to our questions with you so you didn't have to present on it. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. And I'm going to stop the Zoom, which I always think is an abrupt way to say bye. But thank you again, Richard, and keep up the good work. We will definitely
bye, everyone.
keep track of the work.
Back at you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.